A few years ago, I came across a story which profoundly changed the way that I looked at life. It was not by chance that I came across this story. In fact, it was given to me, and not just to me alone, but it was given to a bunch of us by the person who was then the president of Magna Closures, a gentleman by the name of John O'Hara. And John had a task ahead of him. In fact, John had been handed the reins of a small division in the company that I worked for. And the company had been very successful up to that point. In fact, that small division within the framework of this much larger company had reached a point where it was earning about $1 million worth in sales a day. And it was a lot of fun for us. It was quite challenging because we would move around the office and we would all say, I know what it feels like to earn $1 million a day because of the activity, because of the pace, because of the engagement. And John was handed this company at a time when it was doing about $300 million a year, and that's no small task. And before him was this challenge of where do I go from here? And within the framework of that huge challenge that John had to deal with, he felt that the only way that success could be achieved was if he focused on the people. And so he made it his mandate and his purpose that each one of us who was working in that division would have to read this essay that I'm going to share with you this morning. And after I read this essay, it had a profound impact on how I looked at life, on how I looked at work, on how I looked at responsibility. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this essay. It was written in 1899 by a man by the name of Hubbard. And the essay is titled, A Message to Garcia. A Message to Garcia, written in 1899 by a man by the name of Albert Hubbard. And here's what he says. He says, if you work for a man, in heaven's name, work for him. If he pays wages that supply your bread and butter, work for him, speak well of him, think well of him, and stand by him, and stand by the institution he represents. I think if I worked for a man, I would work for him. I would not work for him a part of the time, but all of the time I would give undivided service, next to none. But I pray you, so long as you are part of an institution, do not condemn it. Not that you will injure the institution, not that, but when you disparage the concerns of which you are a part, you disparage yourself. And don't forget, I forget, won't do in business. This literary trifle, A Message to Garcia, was written one evening after supper in a single hour. It was on the 22nd of February, 1899, Washington's birthday. And then the essay gets into the heart of the matter. It gets into something that you and I as Christians ought to pay attention to. Because it comes around to one of the core principles of leadership, one of the core principles that we want to teach our children in this church. And that is initiative. How do I take initiative and become a great leader, become someone on whom God can cast the weight of carrying this message forward? And that is where, to me, this essay became really interesting. And I have kept it with me ever since. This essay has been in my possession for close to 15 years. Here's what it says. It says, the world bestows its big prizes, both in money and honors, but for one thing, and that is initiative. The question is then asked, what is initiative? I tell you, it is doing the right thing without being told. But next to doing the right thing without being told is to do it when you are told once. That is to say, carry the message to Garcia. Those who can carry a message get high honors, but their pay is not always in proportion. Next, there are those who never do a thing until they are told once or twice. Such get no honors and small pay. Next, there are those who do the right thing only when necessity kicks them from behind, and these get indifference instead of honors and a pittance for pay. This kind spends most of its time polishing a bench with a hard luck story. Then still lower down the scale than this, we have the fellow who will not do the right thing even when someone goes along to show him how. The question is then asked, to which class do you belong? And then Hubbard gets into the crux of the story. He said, in all this Cuban business, this is where he illustrates his point. In all this Cuban business, there is one man who stands out on the horizon of my memory like Mars at perihelion. When war broke out between Spain and the United States, it was very necessary to communicate quickly with the leaders of the insurgents. Garcia was somewhere in the vast mountains of Cuba. No one knew where. No mail nor telegraph message could reach him. But the president must secure his cooperation, and quickly. Let me explain to you the situation that is developing here. It's a situation where there is a conflict between Spain and the United States over Cuba. And there's a general in the Cuban forest that the Americans want to get in touch with. No one knows where this man is. No one knows where to find him, but he must be found. And the question becomes, who is able to take on this task of going into this vast jungle wasteland and find this individual? So what should they do? Someone said to the president, there's a fellow by the name of Rowan who will find Garcia for you. If anyone can go into that jungle without instruction, without guidance, without a clue as to where this man is, and find him in the vastness of this dense jungle, it will be this man, Rowan. So Rowan was called and he was put to the test. And here's what happens. This is actually a true story. It says this fellow by the name of Rowan took the letter which outlined the strategy that the Americans were going to use to conquer the Spanish. And he sealed it up in an oilskin pouch. He strapped it over his heart, and he took off into the jungle. For 4 days, he traversed that jungle on foot. And in 3 weeks, no one knew where he was. Except that at the end of those 3 weeks, Rowan walked out of that jungle. And when he walked out of that jungle, guess who was with him? None other than the person he was sent to find. Here's what Hubbard says. Hubbard says, the point that I wish to make is this. McKinley, which was the then president, gave Rowan a letter to be delivered to Garcia. Rowan took this letter and did not ask, "Where is Garcia at?" And then he goes on to say this: "There is a man whose form should be cast in deathless bronze, and the statue placed in every college in the land. It is not by book learning young men. It is not book learning young men need, nor instruction about this and that, but a stiffening of the vertebrae, which will cause them to be loyal to a trust, to act promptly, concentrate their energies, and carry a message to Garcia." He then goes on and asks the question, when you were working with someone and you ask them to do something, how will that person respond? And what he highlights is a response that many of us use to get out of responsibility. He says, when you ask the clerk to do something, will the clerk take the task and say, "Yes, sir," and go to the task? He says, very few will. Very few will. The majority will look at you with a fishy eye and ask one or more of the following questions. What is it that I'm to do? Where am I going to find that? Is this what I was hired to do? What's the matter with asking someone else? How much of a hurry do you need this thing in? Folks, the question that this essay raises is how much initiative, how much willingness do you and I have to take on tasks which seem difficult and insurmountable? And that brings us back this morning to our passage of Scripture. That brings us back this morning to what is said in Deuteronomy chapter 31. We should never fear if we know that God is with us. We should never fear if we know that God is with us. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6 and 8 was read in your hearing. It says, "Be strong and be of good courage. Do not fear or be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you." But there is a preface to this text that we cannot ignore. Because what is said here in verses 6 through 8 is conditioned by what has happened in verse 1 of Deuteronomy chapter 31. Turn there with me and let's look at that together. Deuteronomy chapter 31, or verse 1. Says there, "Then Moses went and spoke these words to all of Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in." Moses was saying to the people, look, the time has come when someone who is younger than I has to take on this task. I'm 120 years old. And the task that we set out from Israel with, the task that we set out from Egypt with to accomplish has not yet been achieved. And it is clear to me that the finishing of this work must fall onto the shoulders of someone else. And it was within the context of this question, it was within the context of this situation that Moses then identified who this work was going to fall to. As we go on, we realize who that person is. Verse 7 says, "Then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, 'Be strong and be of good courage, for you must go with this people to the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them.'" Folks, this morning I want to say to you that the work of evangelizing this world, that the work of spreading the gospel message has not yet been fully accomplished, because if it were accomplished, then Jesus would come. That work is not yet finished. And if we take a look at the person who is sitting next to us, none of us are getting any younger. We're simply getting older. So it says that we may not finish this work. And it is quite typical for us here at Willowdale in the first service to have our more senior members come out. So the point that I'm making this morning is quite relevant. Yes, of course, there are some youth who are sitting among us this morning. But the tendency here in our worship culture at Willowdale is that our first service is generally attended by our older members. So if you look across from you this morning, you're probably looking at someone who is strong in their faith, who has spent a lifetime with the Lord. But the reality is, brothers and sisters, that we are not getting any younger. And the work still needs to be finished. So Moses says in the presence of all of Israel, "Look, I'll admit it. I'm 120 years old. And the Lord has made it very clear to me that the crossing over of Israel, that the crossing over of the Jordan into Canaan is not something that is going to be accomplished by me, but it's going to be accomplished by a generation that is yet to come. So who is going to shoulder this load? Who is going to take this burden upon themselves to achieve this great task?" And he calls upon Joshua to do it. And I believe that Moses calls on Joshua because Joshua has identified something that is spoken of in this essay that I have spent some time sharing with you. Joshua, as a young Christian, as a young follower of God, has displayed courage, integrity, and initiative. I want to invite you to turn with me then to Numbers chapter 13 as we take a quick look. Numbers chapter 13 as we take a quick look at what has distinguished Joshua for this task. You see, folks, what we want to do and the legacy that we want to leave behind us is one of initiative, is one of strong, firm leadership, is one of individuals who will say, "Yes, I am ready." Joshua was very ready. Situation in Numbers chapter 13 is one that we're all very familiar with. Moses selects 12 men. And if we look at Numbers chapter 13, verse 1, we would see that these are not just ordinary individuals that Moses selects. It says there in verse 1, Numbers chapter 13, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man. And then here is the criteria of selection. It says, every one a leader among them. But the reality is that only 2 of these men will behave like leaders when the report comes back to Israel. We know the story. The 12 men are sent off into the land of Canaan, and they see that what God has said is true. The land is a land overflowing with milk and honey. All of the promises, all of the images that God had used to describe what this land were like were true. But there was a problem. There was a problem. And the problem was that there in that land lived men who were like giants. And for some reason, when all 12 of these men saw the giants, only 2 responded with courage, with leadership, and with a sense of initiative. As Israel approached the Jordan River, Moses sent out 12 spies to investigate the promised land. 1 spy from each of the 12 tribes of Israel's entered Canaan, explored the land, and returned with a report. All 12 had the same external experiences, but the internal conclusion of 10 differed markedly from the other 2. Those other 2 were Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb brought back the minority report. 10 other men brought back the majority report. What could account for these differences in opinions? All 12 spies were leaders in their tribes. All 12 spies received the same promises. All 12 spies received the same opportunity. But they came back with different reports. The majority report, which was given by 10 men, said, "No, we cannot go." These 10 men misunderstood their mission. They saw God in light of their circumstances. The minority report said, "Yes, we can go." They understood their mission, and they saw the circumstances in light of their God. Now that's the big difference. Quite often we see the task with respect to our capabilities. But God does not want us to see the task with respect to our capabilities. God wants us to see the task with respect to the capable God that He is. After their return, 10 of the spies displayed a horrible attitude about the whole endeavor. It's not hard to see why. You can't find God anywhere in their attitude. You don't find God being mentioned in their report. His name, if you read Numbers chapters 13 and 14, it never appears once. What appears are the obstacles that they face. However, in the report that is given by Joshua and Caleb, the name of God appears all of the time. In fact, while the 10 say we cannot do this, the 2 say we can do this because of the God that we serve. This morning, as we get ready to celebrate the achievements of our young people as they will sit in these front pews and come up here to receive their certificates, our desire is to see them go from stage to stage, whereby whether they are in the majority or whether they are in the minority, they will always depend on God and His leadership. They will not see the task with respect to their abilities, but they will see the task with respect to what God can do. So what is the major difference? What makes the difference between a person who does what Rowan did? going into the forest and finding Garcia. What makes the difference between a Joshua and a Caleb and the 10 spies? What is it that makes the major difference? Comes down to one word. Comes down to one word. And that word is attitude. You know, as a manager at Magna, when I interviewed people, I would take their resume and I would read through that resume, and I would be aware that what I was looking at was their skills and qualifications. But I would very quickly put those resumes aside when I was interviewing an individual for a job. And I would spend the entire time in the interview process trying to assess one thing. For the 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on which interview it was, I would spend all of my time trying to assess one thing. And that was the individual's attitude. I want to tell you this morning, church, that you can help a person develop skills through training and education and exposure. But the thing that a person must choose to develop for themselves is their attitude. I recognized as a manager, as a leader in Magna, that the one thing that I could not instill in an individual, the one thing that remained as their choice, was attitude. And this is what made the difference. This is what made the difference between Joshua and Caleb and the 10 other spies. It was the attitude that they brought to the task. It was the attitude that they brought to the challenge. You see, all 10 of these spies, as we have read already, had the same experience. Sorry, all 12 of them. All 12 of them had left Egypt. All 12 of them had stood at the Red Sea, with the Egyptians bearing down on them and the sea acting as a barrier before them. All 12 of them saw the sea being opened. All 12 of them had walked across the Red Sea on dry land. All 12 of them had seen how God had done miracles in the wilderness, given them food to eat and water to drink. All 12 of them had seen things that you and I would only hope to see and dream to see. But despite all of these great miracles that they had witnessed, only 2 of them had an attitude change. Attitude is something that a person has to surrender and allow it to be developed as God would have it developed. That was the major difference. It was the difference that allowed 2 to say it can be done and 10 to say no, this is impossible. The only difference between those who delivered the majority report and the minority report was internal. Their differing reports reflected contradictory attitudes towards the land, towards the divine promise, the people in Canaan, the work that was involved. The difference in their report reflected a difference in looking at their Lord and how they looked at themselves. Let's consider the attitude of the majority. The majority disobeyed God. They believed that the land had no future. They displayed cowardice based on fear. They utterly ignored God in their reports. They suffered from a grasshopper complex. If we look at the attitude of those who brought the minority report. They obeyed God. They insisted that they could enter and possess the land. They displayed courage rooted in faith. They felt a calm assurance because God was leading them. They saw themselves in a relationship with God. It was for all of these reasons. It was for all of these reasons that God inspired Moses to lay his hands on Joshua and to give him that assurance that no matter what he does, no matter where he goes, that God is always with him. See, the title of the sermon is Just Say Okay. And that's a pretty capricious statement, isn't it? If I came to you and said, just say okay, you would say to me, say okay to what? Why should I say okay? You better tell me what it is that you want me to do or what it is that you want me to think about before I say okay. I would hazard a guess this morning that sitting before me, if I were to come to you and say, look, you know what, I just want you to say okay. Have you ever played that game with anyone? I have. I just want you to say okay. 9 out of 10 people refuse. Because to just say okay is capricious, depending on who you are saying okay to. But if you are being encouraged to say okay to something that God is calling you to do, if you are being challenged to say okay to something that is the will of God, if you are being challenged to say okay to something that God has said, I will accomplish this through you, then it's all right to just say okay. We can say that because God has promised us, as he did in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 6 to 8, as he did to Joshua, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. Be of good courage. It's not hard to take initiative, folks, when the initiative that we're responding to is something that God has called us to do. It's important for us to have that attitude. It's important for us to develop that attitude as Christians. It is important for us to display that attitude to the younger generation who is looking up to us for an example. You see, in a few minutes from now, these seats will be filled by kids who were looking to you and I for encouragement. They're looking to you and I for example. They're looking to you and I to validate that the promises of God are true. Yes, we say keep your eyes on Jesus, but the kids are looking at you and I as well. And we have to set that example. We have to be bold and strong in the Lord, that through us, they can see perhaps what Joshua saw in Moses. Not an easy task, not a person who did not have trials along the way, but a man who said, look, you know what? It is okay because the work that I'm doing is a work that God has called me to do. Folks, this morning, let our experience be such that we set the example that God has called upon us to set. Let our example be such that we display awesome courage in the face of difficult circumstances. Let our example be such that young folks look at us and see initiative and leadership at work. I encourage you to be a strong example for the youth in our church, to be a strong example because they're looking up to you. They're depending on you. And they're hoping, by God's grace, that some of the things that you have accomplished, and perhaps that some of the things that you have not accomplished, that they will be able to do in service for the Lord. It's okay to just say okay when it is the voice of God that we're responding to.